there's this idea about if we just get Christians involved in politics, that everything's going to be right. I didn't know that conversion made people have political confidence all of a sudden. It's a really kind of interesting thing for people to presume that.
Welcome to the J29 Podcast, hosting conversations for American pastors about politics and culture in their preaching, discipleship, and mentoring. Visit j29coalition.com for more information.
Vince, Jordan, thanks so much for being with us on the J29 Podcast. Many of us who serve as pastors, ministry leaders, we're thinking about how to help our congregation think about faith and politics. You know, how does our faith shape our understanding of the body politic, our own engagement in it? And we're in a moment now in America where the two options that seem most available to us as pastors or as local congregations is either run away from politics altogether, escape, kind of just ignore it. It's all a dirty business. Don't get involved. Or Christian nationalism, like let's put Christians in charge, let's take power, let's rally the troops, and then finally we can, make America, righteous again or something like that. And both of those options, at least to my imagination, feel maybe a bit unwise or unloving. You both have thought deeply about this particular topic, and also some specific figures throughout history within the church who have thought deeply about it. So if not Christian nationalism and if not escapism, then what?
Vince, do you want to go first?
Sure. Part of the then what is recognizing that there are more choices than people recognize.
Okay.
And that a lot of times what people need to recognize is there's an imagination they can have that doesn't require escape or dominance. And the problem with thinking about dominance is you're not going to pull that off. We're in a there's so many different worldviews. You're not going to do that unless you become some kind of totalitarian society, and that's not really what the United States is. And so what you have is a country where you do have, relatively speaking, more political agency than most people have had in world history. Most citizens, if they have at least a smattering of civics, understand that they have political responsibility and opportunity, but it's for the good of everyone. And so a way of starting it is saying, how are you thinking about a way that you can be Christianly engaged, but you're seeking the good of everybody when you don't have the unrealistic expectation that you're going to convert everybody or that everybody is going to agree with you? But you do need to live with these other people that aren't going to agree with you. And there are ways to do that besides saying that I have to only have all Christians in public office, or run away and say that we're a kind of an enclave that models an alternative. To me, that's the most important thing to start with. And then also to recognize, I guess this is what I want to say to pastors is to say, if you have a mission statement at your church and it has something to do with serving people and equipping people to serve people, do you really want to be serving like all human beings? And if you're doing that and you're thinking about whatever way government is involved with that, then how are you thinking about serving all people so that they see that you're seeking the good of everyone and not just the group, the good of a particular group? To me, how does your own documents, your own language about service and mission already kind of give you a staging for that? Because then it's not like you're starting with something external to your tradition. You're starting with familiarity. And once you get to the familiarity, then you can bring in, I think, the assistance from other traditions. So that's part of how I'd like to start that conversation.
Yeah, I fully agree with everything Vince just said. There's obviously attractiveness to having clear choices, like either this one extreme or either this other. But the reality is life is much more complicated than that. And, one of the ways I think of thinking about those, the options, the variety of options between those two extremes is to think about vocation and calling on the one hand, and then what that means for society and maybe even politics more specifically. And so Vince did already touched on a lot of this stuff, so some of it will be repetitive. I might just be using some different terminology, but we may be talking about Abraham Kuyper here in a few minutes. But one of the figures that I draw inspiration from when I'm thinking of the doctrine or the way to think about vocation and calling is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, right? And so he's drawing creatively on this whole tradition of Protestant, Lutheran, and broadly Reformed thinking about calling. And of course, one of his famous books is called Discipleship, right? And the whole point of thinking about calling in that sense is that we all have a common call to follow Jesus. So discipleship is that kind of formally speaking, broad sense of everything we share together as Christians. But then think about the variety and the distinctiveness and the individuality that each one of us has, both in our giftedness, our situations, all the kinds of diversity that God places us in terms of relationships and that particular point in history, a particular city that we live in, the family that we've got, and all that kind of stuff. And so that's where the diversity and the uniqueness comes in. And so doing justice to both of those things, that we have a responsibility to follow Christ wherever he places us and wherever we find ourselves. And then we have our unique stewardship responsibility, to respond to that call. And so that has to involve, I think, from an authentic biblical perspective, being faithful in all of our life, right? So avoiding a sacred secular dichotomy, embracing what that means to do in all aspects of our life, which do include political dimensions, that may be different depending on the place we're at in life, but all of us are citizens. So we have that shared, responsibility. Some of us are called to, serve in public office or engage politically as professionals. If you're in a think tank, like some people are, if you work in an advocacy organization and so on. So those are the ways that I try to think about the commonality and the individuality of this responsibility.
So you mentioned a person who I've heard of before, and people say fancy things with his name. So Abraham Kuyper, or they say words like Kuyperian thought. What is that? It's not in the Bible, Jordan. Vince.
That's right.
Some people talk about it like it's in the Bible. I haven't found Kuyperian in the Bible, but it sounds like it's some dude who thought a lot about faith and politics. So help us. Who's Kuyper?
Maybe I'll say a little bit here, Vince, and then you can fill in the gaps or things that I miss. Does that work good? So,
Okay.
19th century Dutch figure. So, born 1837, dies in 1920. So those are his dates. And one of the reasons he's really, I think, inspirational for the people who have heard him, or for the traditions and institutions that are downstream of his influence, is that he really was a polymath and accomplished in all kinds of areas. So the most famous quote is sometimes summed up in a little pithy "every square inch," right? But the quote itself has to do with him talking about Jesus Christ claiming sovereignty over all of creation. And so that's the part that I think, he is most known for, and then he most embodies, in the sense that he himself was trying to live out that robust understanding of vocation and discipleship that I just talked about in all areas of life. So he was trained theologically. He served as a pastor. He helped lead an exodus from the kind of dominant church, the mainline church in the Netherlands, to create a new denomination. He helped found a university. He founded newspapers. He helped found a political party and developed that political party into a powerful force in the Netherlands, served in government, became prime minister, on and on and on and on. So 6 years ago now was the centenary of his passing, and the institution that he helped found, called the Free University in Amsterdam, described him as a cultural entrepreneur. That was a good way to kind of capture all of these things. So he not only did all those things, but he engaged in them in a very intellectual and insightful way, in the sense of his reflections on what it meant to be a follower of Christ in all these different areas. So I like to say that he did lots of things. Everything he didn't do, he also thought about, and everything he did do, he thought about. So even where you disagree with him, and I'm sure we'll talk at some point about the things that Kuyper got wrong, or the things he didn't think about. everything he did and everything he thought about is worth engaging with, even if you end up disagreeing with him, because you always learn something from him. So that's a little bit of a thumbnail sketch. You could go on and on talking about Kuyper, but I want to make sure Vince has a chance to fill out that brief sketch.
Yeah, he is an example of what I would call a walking public faith, right? But not only public faith, because he also wrote all these devotionals. So there's no choosing between having a pious life and a pursuit of this discipleship. That's a holistic discipleship that Jordan was talking about earlier. And so he really did embody that. Did he do it imperfectly? Of course he did. He's a human being. But perhaps one of the most important things about him doing it is, and it's really important for people to get this right, is Jordan mentioned he was a pastor. There are people who will hear that he became prime minister, and they think it means that meant the denomination he was a part of was trying to run the Netherlands. That's because they're not actually even asking, well, how did he become prime minister in the first place? There's no way he becomes prime minister without coalition building. And just to make it really interesting, that included a coalition that had Roman Catholic parties. Okay, so point being is that he needed to work with other people in order to become prime minister. And interestingly, also for people that I think they get excited about Kuyper and they have a very flat, small picture of him, they think, and Kuyper wanted to implement X, Y, and Z. Well, actually, he was kind of a mediocrity as a prime minister. He was way more successful before he's prime minister. You could argue that his zenith is the decade going into him being prime minister. And I only say that to help people to understand that there's this idea about if we just get Christians involved in politics, that everything's going to be right. I didn't know that conversion made people have political competence all of a sudden. It's a really kind of interesting thing for people to presume that. Some people say they really do not need to be like in the room where it happens, so to speak. There are other people, and I think this is an interesting thing for pastors to think about. Who are the people in your congregations that maybe you should be encouraging toward public service? And who are the people you might say, you love power, you do not need to be doing this because your head will be too big to even fit in the room. And so the point being is that there are ways in which Kuyper is really helpful, not just because he tells us that you can get in the game, but also because when he becomes prime minister, in fact, when he goes into politics in the 1870s, he steps out of being a pastor. And he's making clear in so many things that he writes that he wants Christian influence, but Christian influence doesn't mean that churches are in the ear of the people who are in public office saying, now, before you propose that policy, you've got to bring it before the elder board so we can vet that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
That is not happening. And so he talks about a Christian engagement that is definitely Christian, but that is not determined by church leadership. And so he has a distinction between what we call the sphere of the church and the sphere of politics. But the church ought to be equipping people who can be in their formed and in that their vocation, to again echo what Jordan said earlier, that if their vocation includes political life, some kind of public service, that their formation doesn't stay in the church, it goes with them into their engagement in politics. And it ought to be forming their perceptions as they're working with and discerning how to form public policy and how to seek the public good. And I think Kuyper says that a lot. And I think a lot of times people, again, have this simple idea that if you're a Christian, you're going to be involved in politics, it must mean you want the church to take over. No, he wants Christians who have the opportunity to serve if it's the right kind of person, let's say. The right kind of person is going to be a person who's having their deep formation go with them, and it's informing how they're going about their public engagement. But they're not trying to turn the political realm into a church.
So the normal way under this kind of paradigm or example for Kuyper that the church engages politically is not the church as an institution, he would say. Although there are instances where the church does have an institutional public, character in the sense that it's organized and recognized and has its own rights as a kind of a separate institution. But it's through the body of believers as they're scattered, so you could use the kind of scattered and gathered imagery to think about how the church engages politically. And it's the church as it's scattered out in the world in the individual believers' callings and their places and stations in life that the church is represented politically. And that's the body of Christ in society. And so you could press that imagery too far, that distinction too far. But that's the kind of normal way that in a free and functioning, healthy society that the church ought to be engaging and sharing its the gifts of the individual Christians as they gather together themselves in different kinds of institutions, whether it's a business, a charity, a school, and so on, that they serve society.
And that quote that Jordan made reference to, that there's no square inch over the entire creation over which Jesus Christ is Lord over all, does not say mine. The square inch, every square inch. People read that and they think it means, Jesus is sovereign over every inch. Therefore, we should be the ones who are acting like we're sovereign over every inch.
Right.
His whole point
Christ
is
who's sovereign, right?
Yeah. Christ is the one who's sovereign, not us. And the context in which he's saying that is he's talking about the public space for a Christian university. And I note that just to say that it's important for people to understand that he wants people participating in every square inch of life as Christians. And the point is he wants them participating as Christians, not taking over as Christians. Now, there are other smaller details about that, about whether you can have like smaller Christian institutions, that type of stuff. But his big point with that quote is it's proper for Christians to be involved in all those domains of life. Mm-hmm. And honestly, in his own context, he never could have dreamed of dominating all that because he was the leader of a minority movement. And so for people to think that that quote is somehow a doorway into saying we ought to be seeking dominance, it's missing the entire context in which Kuyper is doing that. And that's why I mentioned the part about he had to have a coalition with other people in order to become prime minister. You have to work with other people. And so we you've got to be able to do that as a Christian, however you're going to be encouraging people to be involved in public engagement. Expect to work with people that are not like you. How are you going to work well with them?
Yeah.
I mean, have ideas, propose your ideas, argue for your ideas, but also get other people on board rather than having other people just have to conform exactly to you. I mean, it's a pipe dream to do that. I mean, in fact, I always want to ask people, can people even do that in their own family? That everything's conforming exactly to who you are? Probably not, right? For most families. Point being, but you want that for all of society. It's like an imaginary thing to kind of make somebody. I mean, it's simple to think about it that way. So there's a comfort with that, but it's unrealistic. Mm-hmm. Whereas we can bring good to society, working well with others, and even surprising people who might think that because we're Christian and we want to be involved in public life, that it has to mean that we must see them as enemies, rather than that we're seeing them as fellow image bearers, and we think that because we're Christians and the gospel is good news, and it's good news because God cares about this world and God wants to order this world in certain ways. There are ways that we can think about translating this and proposing, using our imagination to think about policies that can help make the public order better. But it's about really trying to be good for everybody, not only good for us.
So that be good for everybody thing. What if I think what is good for everybody is different than what they think is good for their own self? I might say, well, the Bible says what's good for you is, this kind of marriage. You think it's good to have this kind of marriage. And now we're having a disagreement over the definition of what is good for you. How might Kuyper's thought help us in those situations where we're disagreeing on what is good? And I might add real quick, not neutrally, like when I'm in a position of government power,
right,
who could enforce what I think is good, but then 65% of my constituents think that's not good. What's my responsibility then?
Well, I mean, maybe for Kuyper you could say, and I think for people who are committed to the Bible and the authority of Scripture, the first thing is to affirm that there are truths about the world, that there is objective reality. And, there's a sense in which Kuyper is intending to see a society where there's structural pluralism and there's structural space for people to explore and live out faithfully their convictions, however they disagree, right? So in a principled sense, Kuyper is talking about the rights for, his party, his people, his church to create their own institutions, like a Calvinistic university. But at the same time, he's going to say, and Jews should be able to freely be able to create their own university system. The secular liberals should have, well, first of all, the secular liberals already have their university system, but they should be free to do theirs. The Roman Catholics ought to have the rights to create their own institutions as well. And so it's principled in that sense that it applies equally to everybody in terms of these kind of common rights. But he's also very, clear that the government has its own responsibility before God. And even if it's not Christians serving in the government, when Paul in Romans 13 is talking about the role of, you warned me about using this word too much, but the role of the civil magistrate, that's got objective responsibilities in this institution, regardless of the confessional adherence or non-adherence of the people who are in the government, right? And so you cannot avoid the question of what is true and what is right. Yes, in charity and in respect and humility of all of our limited understandings, you should draw those lines as widely as possible. But there are limits to the equality, you could say, or the treatment of everyone on all kinds of questions, right? So think about it very practically in the American context. The political philosopher William Galston, has this kind of pithy phrase: "No free exercise for Aztecs." Right? We've got a very robust, unique situation of disestablishment at the federal level in the United States with respect to establishment and free exercise of religion. But there's always going to be limits because you inevitably run up against questions of objective truth and what harm consists in and all of those kinds of other questions, right? So in America, we try throughout our checkered political history to draw those lines at our best when, as widely as we possibly can, but we recognize that there are limits that you run up against. And for Kuyper, those are going to be very clear limits with respect to what the Bible teaches about the natural law and the moral order and God's will for our lives, right? So that's a lot, and I'm sure Vince has other things to say too. But I think that's at least my best way, I think, of trying to articulate, a framework for the question in a broad sense.
And part of it is, I think, is articulating the fact that because I believe that God says that there's this moral order, there's a way things should be. It doesn't mean that because I say that to you that I want to harm you. And part of that means trying to finding imaginative ways to change the discourse so that it doesn't become mainly about sentimentalizing about who's trying to harm who or gaslight who or whatever. It's just trying to speak with integrity about this is how we understand how we're thinking about marriage, let's say.
And we're talking rather than,
exactly
threatening to use the sword or coerce somebody. Right?
Yes, exactly. And then and another dimension of this is that Kuyper acknowledges when there's this quote he has about when he talks about what a Christian nation is. He says, nobody expects that to be a nation in which everybody's a Christian. I mean, it'd be nice, but that's not what you're expecting. But you are wanting it to be something that's elevating everybody. And so you have to be making an argument why in a society where people have different worldviews, at least when there's this thing that you're calling marriage and being very precise about what you mean when you say that, that here's why you're taking the position that, a particular view of marriage is good as opposed to, say, polyamory or something. And one may argue that, no, because I think that ultimately it leads to the public good, et cetera, et cetera. But all that has to be done in a way where Romans 13:10 is very clear. Love does no harm to a neighbor. In other words, I don't use my commitment to the truth to make me function like a hammer and you're a nail. And sometimes I think that if there's this kind of, well, we've got to fight for this, all right? And now what I would say in the context of, we're in the United States, we're post-Obergefell. It's a trickier situation because now that's what's on the books. So you're going to have a hard time unless the Supreme Court changes it. And of course, who knows? Because, I didn't think Roe versus Wade was going to get overchanged. Because none of the justices said they were going to overturn it. And it happened. So who knows? But if it's not overturned, then I think the conversation has to be saying, here's why I have disagreements about that. But you must understand that, okay, if you're calling that a marriage and you're on my street, and if you're having problems and you need help, I'm going to help you. If you got kids and you're having parenting troubles, I'm not going to say because I don't think you have a marriage, I'm not going to help you. I'm going to be your neighbor. I don't have to agree with everything about the way you do things in order for you to treat you like a neighbor. And there's so much that discourse winds up being about this. You must want to basically destroy me if you disagree with me. When, of course, people are always very selective about that, because if you ask them about all the disagreements that they have, so is every disagreement a death match? It's not, but it's an effective rhetorical tool.
Yeah.
If you want to kind of gain the upper hand in a particular way. But it must be clear that Christians, when they're disagreeing with people, that they're saying this is because I genuinely want to care for people rather than make people's lives really distressed, which means that there need to be other ways that Christians are showing that, hey, even if I disagree with you about how you're defining marriage, you know what? I don't want you to feel like you need to feel like you're in danger in this country.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that is, to me, extremely important because there are people who think that that's what will happen. And of course, now we do have some people being of the persuasion where they would say, well, actually, if we were in charge, you might be in danger.
Yes.
Now, so I think that's part of what we have to do. And again, going back to what the different pastors who are watching this, what your churches teach, what do your churches say, what does your own language say about the kind of church you are, about how you are disposed toward all other human beings, whether they are Christian or not? Are you forming people that are serving and loving everybody?
Yeah.
And if that's what you're doing, then how are you doing that also when it comes to the political dimension?
It seems to me that what we're into here is when we're in pursuit of what we think are Christian ends, we also need to pursue those through Christian means. So the way that we're behaving also needs to be shaped by our understanding of Scripture, not just the end, the policy, the whatever it might be. And much of what I see in American Christian nationalism today is the desire is, or the promise is, righteous ends, but we're going to get there through unjust means. We're going to cajole, we're going to fearmonger, we're going to power play, we're going to condemn, sometimes even some of these purveyors of Christian nationalism, we're going to propagate violence. As we're concluding our time together, we're thinking about what it means to faithfully follow the way of Jesus and think and act in the body politic in the year of our Lord 2026 in America, which is different, I think, than Kuyper's Netherlands. What advice do you think Kuyper would give to us today if he was sitting in a room full of pastors? Help us.
First of all, they would have to be there a very long time because he was he was very willing. That's why I started laughing, because it's like, what would Kuyper say today? It's like he would say, "Okay, folks, you're going to need to be here a while."
It wouldn't be a workshop. It would be a conference.
It would be, well,
a series of
I'm
lectures.
not even sure how dialogical it would be. I mean, it would be because he was very, so he was a great man, but one of his flaws is that he knew he was a great man. Anybody who tells you that the guy wasn't a genius is lying.
Yeah.
as Nick Waldorf puts it, the man was an intuitive genius. Really, this polymath that he could just do stuff.
Yeah.
And had capacity, and I mean, it's unbelievable. But sometimes he didn't know that he needed like other people.
Right.
But what I think the big thing he would say to people is, God gives you the opportunity in His world to serve His world, which includes developing it in positive ways, and people who are made alive by God have the opportunity where they are to discern how to seek that good. And you do it with an expectation where hopefully people will get converted, but a lot of people aren't going to be on your team in terms of where you are spiritually, but you are definitely helping people to be equipped to be these disciples who are going out seeking the good of everybody, and sometimes that's through politics.
I think if he had to distill, and it's always dangerous, obviously, to try to speak for Kuyper, but so the most I'll claim is I'm speaking as someone inspired by him and trying to channel that the best I can. I think he would say, it's a fool's errand, it's a false choice to think that to influence the world positively, that needs to be the main thing that you're focused on, and that Vince talked earlier about how Kuyper himself embodied both being effective and engaged in the public spaces, as well as being a faithful Christian privately and in his own piety. And I think the message that we can all learn, and that I certainly try to keep it in front of mind and live out every day, is that we have to be faithful with what we've been given, and that starts with ourselves. And so authentic engagement out there is going to only come from kind of your faithfulness in your relationship with God and your own practices of piety and devotion and so on. And it's not a zero sum, right? That you got to be more focused internally and then ignore everything else that's going on. In fact, the more that you are conformed to Christ's image, the more you are going to, by new nature, embody that kind of discipleship in the world. And that's a very, I think, not exclusively Kuyperian, a very biblical sentiment, but something that Kuyper, I think, at his best, both modeled and spoke about.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, thank you both so much for being with us. Where can people find you and your work?
So I'm at the Center for Religion, Culture, and Democracy. We're at crcd.net. I'm on most social media platforms too, very occasionally, but I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
I teach at Wheaton College, where it is warmer today, thankfully, in the Midwest, because sometimes it's cold. But also I have a personal website, www.vincentbacote.com. And you can find all of my things there.
Cool. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.